so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government.
Of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Wilfred McClay, and this is The Revolution of Self-Rule, a title I hope we'll explain as we go. Although I thought about calling it From Martin Luther to Thomas Jefferson, and that will give you a sense of just how much ground we're going to try to cover in the next few minutes or so. Let me go back to Lewis Mumford, the quotation that I mentioned last time about the settlement of America having its origins in the unsettlement of Europe. Of all the unsettlements that Europe experienced, the unsettlement with regard to religion was probably the most consequential, which is not to say that it isn't connected to all sorts of other things relating to this downward movement from the high point of the High Middle Ages around the year 1300, in which all of Europe was unified around at least Western Europe was unified around the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, as its binding force. And its presence was everywhere, from the structure of towns to the obligations of lords and vassals under the feudal system. This unity, of course, was not destined to last. All sorts of tensions and forces tore at it. And among those, the rebellion initiated by Martin Luther and John Calvin, the two great Reformation figures whose combined efforts, not that they combined with one another, had the effect of leaving the religious map of Europe forever divided. They had legitimate and interesting complaints. Luther thought that the Bible taught a very different approach to justification, the way by which one makes one's relationship with God right and secures salvation, that this was not secured by works. It was not a product of the institutional church, but was strictly grounded in the relationship of the individual believer to God, and that belief was something that came through faith alone and not through works. Calvin agreed with much of this, but he importantly affected the future of the church by rejecting the institutional structure of the governance structure of the Catholic Church that Lutheranism had really largely kept, held over from Calvinism, that is the hierarchy of bishops. He abolished that, and in favor of elected bodies made up of ministers and laymen, which brought a principle of democratic self-governance into the church. Some Calvinists, they even favored a congregational form of organization in which each individual church governed itself and was not part of a hierarchical order of any kind. Without getting into too much further, more deeply into these issues, it suffices to say that Western Christianity was fracturing and fragmenting into a great many pieces. There are many others involved other than Luther and Calvin. But they, I think, will suffice for our purposes to give a sense of the degree of unsettlement and some of the sources of unsettlement. But let's narrow the focus a little bit to England, to the English Reformation, because the English Reformation was different than the Reformation on the continent, the Reformation in Germany and elsewhere. There's a lot about England. England is always different from the continent, and its Reformation was also different. Its unsettlement was different. At the time the Reformation was getting underway in Germany, Henry VIII, King of England, was a fierce defender of the Catholic Church, so much so that Pope Leo X called him defender of the faith. But Henry was also a king, and he wanted, above all else, to keep the Tudor dynasty, which he'd inherited from his father, in charge and keep at bay the forces of disintegration that his father had had to tame in coming to power in the 15th century. So to do this, he felt he needed a male heir to his throne. And since his wife of 20 some odd years 23 years of marriage had not given him one, he requested a divorce, an annulment really, by the Pope to allow him to marry a second woman. The Pope denied this for political reasons that are too complicated to go into, but not really on theological grounds so much as political grounds. Henry's response was immediate and volcanic. He went on to sever the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, made himself the supreme head of the church, had the Archbishop of Canterbury take care of the old marriage, and he went ahead and passed an act of supremacy through the Parliament, to which all subjects were to be thenceforth required to pledge their loyalty and obedience, closed the monasteries, and basically stripped the Roman Catholic Church of its power in England. In a sense, the English Reformation was the opposite of the Lutheran Reformation. Luther was driven by questions of theology, not by politics. And when it came to politics, he actually was fairly conservative, quite conservative, in fact. In the case of England, it was politics and not theology that provoked Henry's break from Rome. He was perfectly content to maintain the sacramental structure, the theological structure, the organizational structure of the church. It was simply his political needs that had to be met. So once the dust settled and his daughter Elizabeth was queen, one of the great monarchs of English-British history, the question remained, if England was going to be a Protestant country, was it to be Protestant and Catholic in the first place, but if it was going to be Protestant, what kind of Protestantism would this be? There were various elements, the residue of this peculiar separation that had occurred, various elements at work in the church that were, some of which were high church elements that wanted to keep as Catholic, capital C, as possible in every respect other than the recognition of the papacy. Then there were reformers who were influenced by Calvinism, who'd been educated on the continent, who thought the reformers were right, that the church was corrupt. It needed to be purged of all of its unbiblical, unworldly, or all too worldly elements. So you had all kinds of divisions within the Church of England over what kind of direction it should take. And of course, the faction that wanted to see the church cleansed of its corruptions came to be known as the Puritans. We'll come back to them in a moment. These developments matter so much, I'm talking about England so much, because of the fact that England eventually becomes the predominant influence in the settlement of North America. But it's very important not to move too quickly to that without taking into account how dominant the Spanish were for the first 100 years or so of the Western Hemisphere after Columbus. The Spanish were utterly dominant in the settlement of the Western Hemisphere for a mix of reasons. Some of them naked materialism, the mercantilism to which the Spanish were committed made the New World a ripe plucking ground for precious metals that would boost the size and wealth of the Spanish treasury. There were also strong religious motives, a desire to convert the peoples of the New World to Catholicism. So it's no one thing. The extinction of native peoples, that's one of the really ugly parts of that story, actually happened mainly because of biological reasons, the epidemic spread of diseases to which New World inhabitants had no immunities. At any rate, here's the important thing to know about the Spanish. Politically speaking, the Spanish approach to colonization was top-down. They wanted to centralize the undertaking. They wanted colonization to serve the interests of the mother country. They were not primarily interested in creating settlements that would become self-sustaining entities. And that is quite a contrast to the English, as we'll see in a moment. The Spanish eventually came under attack. All of those ships carrying gold and silver back from the New World began to be attacked by French privateers, then Dutch, then English. In fact, the English privateers were quietly supported by Queen Elizabeth herself, and as a way of getting back at the Spanish. Eventually, Spanish ruler Philip II had enough of this, and he decided he was going to assemble an invincible armada that would send 130 ships, the largest fleet ever seen in Europe, to take on and invade England. Well, this is the famous Battle of the Spanish Armada, and through a series of favorable developments, which some have seen as an expression of divine favor because they are quite remarkable, the English defeated this armada soundly, decisively. And from 1588 on, the Star of England was on the rise, and the Star of Spain was drooping in irretrievable decline. This defeat of the Armada is important for us in American history because it helped to determine at least what kind of culture North America was not going to primarily have. This is not to say North America would be free of Spanish influence, and we know from the titles of the names of cities like Los Angeles and Santa Fe that would not be so. But the defeat of the Armada opened the way for England to take the lead role in settling North America. And the result would be a continent whose institutions, laws, and government would reflect their English antecedents. What were the implications of this? There are many, but I'll settle on a couple. The monarchies of France and Spain were embracing absolutism, this centralized control of power in the hands of a single sovereign whose prerogatives were grounded ultimately in divine fiat. They were seen as ruling by divine right. The English followed a very different route. The crown had always had restraints on its power. The crown had to share power with aristocrats and gentry who convened independently as a legislative body called Parliament that would control, among other things, the power of the purse, the ability to authorize and impose taxes. So the crown didn't control everything, couldn't control everything. And its powers were limited, maybe above all else, by a conviction that the people possessed powers independently of the crown, fundamental rights that no monarch could challenge or withdraw. These rights were grounded in the English tradition of common law, which was an approach to law that relied on precedent rather than on judicial principles. So it had an historical dimension. Rights like the right to trial by jury or protection from unwarranted searches and seizures were inviolable because they were enshrined in law and custom. They were woven into the warp and woof of English life. Second factor is the English approach to colonization. It's unlike the Spanish. English colonization of the New World was a pretty haphazard thing. There was no blueprint. There was no master plan. It was a private undertaking, largely, a collection of uncoordinated private undertakings taken by various kinds, a really motley collection of entrepreneurs, visionaries, religious zealots, and such, each seeking the fresh opportunities, that new hope of freedom, in pursuing their ends without having to be steered by a larger national vision. They were free to do as they pleased. So each of these colonial enterprises had its own profile, its own aspirations, its own distinctive way of understanding America as a land of hope. The hopes were different. So the contrasts among them, we could spend a lot of time talking about. Let me just talk about a couple. The first two. Virginia. Virginia was the first permanent English colony. started in 1607 at Jamestown. It was a nakedly, materialistically oriented enterprise. Its goal was, quote, to dig, mine, and search for all manner of mines of gold, silver, and copper. There you go. It sounds very Spanish. Unfortunately, the men who came to Jamestown and subsequently to Virginia were supremely ill-equipped for the kinds of tasks and kinds of skills necessary to the founding of a new colony. They were city boys. They didn't know anything about farming. They didn't know anything about woodcraft or hunting or all the things one needed to know about. So they very nearly failed completely. It was only through the sort of heroic manhandling undertaken by Captain John Smith, who took control of the colony and forced only those who worked to be able to eat, put down rebellions and impose some order. But even with that, the colony was barely hanging on. Finally, the big change that came was the discovery of tobacco and of tobacco's potential as a commercial crop. And by 1639, the tobacco production had soared to 3 million pounds per year, which was a solid basis for an economy. Not a particularly admirable basis, but even then, tobacco has never been regarded as a health product. But a solid basis nonetheless for prosperity, for the sustainability of the colony. By contrast, New England was settled by Puritans. Puritans being those who believed the Church of England had not gone nearly far enough to purge itself of its Catholic corruptions, and came to the conclusion that this renewal was not going to happen in England proper. So they came to New England, and they very consciously saw themselves as carrying out a divine mission. They were creating a new Zion, a new Israel in a new land. This divinely ordained mission was an errand into the wilderness. They would create holy commonwealths, models for the reformation of the church. There were important differences among the various Puritan or Calvinist colonies. The Pilgrims, so-called, who came in 1620 were different from the ones who came later. I want to talk mainly about the later ones, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which created what became Boston, 1630. Under the leadership of the lawyer John Winthrop, they had received a charter from Charles I to come to this colony. Before they made landfall, Winthrop preached what's been called a lay sermon, called A Model of Christian Charity. He laid out the settlement's mission and its guiding purposes. Nothing like this happened in Virginia. It's a beautiful speech. It's one of the classics of American literature. And he says in the speech the following: "We are entered in a covenant with God for this work. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together. We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." What an audacious statement, considering they were landing on the other side of the world, the equivalent of the dark side of the moon. And they imagined this inhospitable place full of unfamiliar wild animals and peoples coming from a comfortable middle-class background of England. What could they imagine that the eyes of all people were upon them? It tells you something about the zeal behind their undertaking, that they saw themselves as reenacting the great exodus of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt to come to the promised land. So their religious faith sustained them. And there were other variations in the themes of colonization. There were other religious colonies. There were other materialistically oriented colonies. There were utopian colonies. The colony of Georgia was a utopian idea. of the philanthropist James Oglethorpe. Many of these colonies, in one way or another, did reflect idealistic aims on the parts of their founders, and a striking number of them were based on a kind of desire to renew the world, to restore it, to recover some portion of the unity that had existed before the Great Unsettlement, or to take elements of the Great Unsettlement and bring them to greater realization in a unpopulated or underpopulated land. Most of these efforts, in fact, all of them, in some respect, failed if we hold them to their original intentions. Daniel Boorstin says the colonies were disproving ground for utopias. Well, that's probably true in a sense, but what did happen, and this makes up the theme of the rest of my remarks, is that they learned the capacity for self-rule. Colonial life was experimental. It depended on the self-rule of the subjects of their colonial masters, who were far, far away and not able to really take part in the day-to-day act of governance. So they were Englishmen who had adapted English traditions of custom and customary usages, the English law, English common law, and self-rule. But they found themselves in a situation where they were apart from their English confreres. The fact of self-rule is helped out by the fact that I've already mentioned before, that the English really didn't have a plan for overall colonial policy. And they really, even if they had one, they were not able to enact it because they were so busy fighting with one another. All through the 17th century, this battle over the question of how Britain would relate to the question of the divine right of kings, of absolutism. Would it fall in line with the continental powers, or would there be a distinctively English way of retaining powers over against the crown, lodged in the people and in other representative bodies? Anyway, there was no appetite, no energy for an organized colonial policy to be imposed on the North Americans. So they went their own way. They protected by the fact that the deepest political traditions of the English people were opposed to absolutism. And in the end, that tradition triumphed, notably by the time of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which we won't go through too much except to say that it provided, as you'll see in a minute, a precedent for the American Revolution. So colonial affairs were on the back burner so far as Britain was concerned. But that had to change. Eventually, the colonial powers would bump up against one another in North America, and push would come to shove, and war would come about. And it happened finally in what we call the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, same thing, in a battle between France and England over dominance in North America. And to make a long story short, England decisively won the French and Indian War with some help from its American subjects, but it was mainly an English undertaking. And the victory was expensive. It was costly in terms of men, material, and debt. And it forced a rethinking of the whole colonial enterprise. The Americans, after all, were the ones who were the beneficiaries, the chief beneficiaries of this war. Shouldn't they pay something for the execution of the war? And so the notion of taxing the colonies, of bringing to bear a more integrated approach to the governance of the empire began to take hold. Every great victory brings new problems in its wake, and this was one. The British had to rethink the empire. They had to rethink an imperial system in which the Americans would pay their fair share. But the profoundly English tradition of self-rule was hard to square with that. How were the Americans going to continue to rule themselves and yet be more subject than they had been to Parliament and the king? At the same time this is happening, the colonies, as partly as a result of the French and Indian War and other things, began to have a stronger sense of themselves as a people, not just Englishmen who happened to be on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, but as people of English heritage who had their Americanness in common. It's much too far to say that they had a national form of consciousness. That's way off. But there are a couple of events, one that influence things, nudge things in that direction, a couple of developments, I should say. One is the rise of revivalistic religion, the Great Awakening, which swept through the seaboard, the Atlantic seaboard in the 1730s and 1740s, and introduced a new kind of worship, what we would call evangelical worship, energetic, emotional, enthusiastic worship that focused on the idea of a new birth, of a born-again, regenerative experience in the life of the convert. Figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were part of this. And the Great Awakening had the effect of destabilizing existing structures of authority and empowering individuals to be more independent. Similarly, the advent of the Enlightenment, which really took hold in America and was very consonant with American ideals, had emphasized a skepticism about inherited tradition, a willingness to reconsider practices and ideas in the light of reason alone. Benjamin Franklin who was certainly a major figure at the time of the Revolution, would be a perfect American exemplar of that Enlightenment way of thinking. And actually, both the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening shared this common element of skepticism about received tradition and established forms of authority. And both had the effect of weakening affiliation with traditional institutions. So back to the French and Indian War, the British had a problem. They had now had an empire that encircled the globe. They controlled North America. The problem of imperial governance could no longer be put on hold. So it was time to begin to tighten the screws on the colonies. And we could spend a lot of time talking about each act and how each effort caused the colonists to redouble and deepen their determination to be independent, and on the other side, caused British authorities to redouble their efforts to bring the colonies to heel, that it's now or never in that task. After the French and Indian War, there's this series of acts: the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act. You all may have learned about these in school, and I'm not going to go through all the details of them, except to say that they had the effect of trying to bring the colonists within an imperial system of taxation, of levying taxes, and they were resisted at every turn. Prime Minister Grenville at one point suggested that Americans were represented in Parliament by something called virtual representation, a concept the colonists rejected as a bunch of rubbish, and I think rightly so. A series of inconclusive acts, finally culminating in the coercive acts directed at Boston because of the Boston Tea Party and some other things, caused the colonies to unite in a kind of temporary way in creating something called the Continental Congress in 1774. So politically speaking, they were beginning to act together, even though they never thought of themselves together, except by terms of their linkage to England. But the Continental Congress and movements to boycott English goods and other forms of resistance were building a new sensibility in America. John Adams said the revolution was effected before the war commenced. He said that when the people saw the behavior of the king, the laws and constitution derived to them from the God of nature and transmitted to their ancestors being violated and renounced by the king and parliament, This radical change in the principles and the opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people occurred that was the real American Revolution. So there was a change of heart, according to John Adams, that presaged a political change. The fuse of war was lit in 1775, April 1775, when orders reached the governor of Massachusetts, the royal governor, to move to stop the rebellion. General Thomas Gage was sent to march 700 red-coated British troops to Concord, where there was a colonial militia supply depot. They countered colonial resistance along the way. The shot fired in Lexington became the shot heard round the world, and the war was on, a hot war between the colonists and the mother country. Even some patriots balked at this. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania worried that once the colonies were separated, they would be at the mercy of foreign powers. There was no cohesive element to hold them together. If they were torn from the body to which were united by religion, liberty, laws, affections, relations, language, and commerce, we will bleed at every vein. Several more things had to happen to get past those kinds of objections. First, the British refused to conciliate. Second, they started using hired mercenary troops, Hessians, from Germany to fight the colonies, which they took as a terrific insult, that they were being treated in a way that English citizens would never be treated, being fought against by mercenaries. Then finally, there was a publication in 1776 of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, which had an enormous effect in riveting the attention of the colonists to the revolutionary cause and galvanizing them to accept it. He focused all of his ire on the king, not so much Parliament as the king. And George Washington himself said, "Common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of men." It sold more than 150,000 copies, which is roughly the equivalent of 3 million copies today, in the first few months of 1776. So finally, the Continental Congress met and decided to move decisively towards independence. And it was on the 4th of July in that year, 1776, that Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which is a remarkable document, drafted mainly by the 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson said later, almost 50 years later, just before he died, he said, I did not consider it any part of my charge to invent new ideas. His goal in writing the Declaration was, quote, not to find out new principles, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject and formulate an expression of the American mind that would draw its authority from the harmonizing sentiments of the day. It wasn't revolutionary in that sense. It didn't depart from what he understood to be the general sentiment, the consensus of the American people. He drew on various authorities in doing so, ranging from John Locke's second treatise on government to the ideas of some of his fellow Americans like the Virginian George Mason. And anyway, he propounded a document that has really been a document for the ages. And you notice in the quotation I read from Jefferson, he said, put before mankind the common sense of the subject. He was consciously speaking not only to his countrymen, but to the world. The Declaration of Independence was a kind of press release to the world, explaining not only why we were doing what we were doing, but the principles behind it. Accordingly, Jefferson declared it was self-evidently truth, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments existed solely for the purpose of protecting these rights, securing these rights. And they derived their powers, their just powers, from the consent of the governed, not from the divine right of kings, the consent of the governed, which is really a concise way of saying from self-rule. This is the principle of self-rule. Governments that fail in this task and fail to sustain the consent of the governed deserve to be replaced. The people had the right, even the responsibility, to abolish it, which is to say they had the right of revolution. A long list of grievances followed, not as familiar to us and to the world as the preamble, but all of it is well worth reading and taking to heart, particularly the declaration at the very end of the declaration, in which the signatories pledge their sacred honor to the task before them. It's a magnificent document, and it deserves to be read again and again, maybe at least once a year by every American. But it also left some questions unanswered. And fortunately, we have another chapter to deal with those, but our next lecture. But questions like, what kind of union was this embracing? The document spoke of a colonial union of free and independent states. What does that mean, to be free and independent states and be in a union? How is that possible? And then finally, there were those pregnant words, all men are created equal. What did they mean? Did they include women? Was there a larger, more universal sense to these words? Or did they only apply to men? Were they meant to distinguish to link Americans and Englishmen and say that they're equal? And then what about the institution of slavery? The very existence of which in all the colonies at this time, not just the South, all the colonies, would appear to call into question the legitimacy of the entire structure of Jefferson's resonant words. What did Jefferson think he was saying? Jefferson, a slaveholder, when he said these words about all men. How could he have failed to realize that these words could not accommodate an institution that traded in the flesh of human beings? Well, these are questions that lay in the future, and much of the future, perhaps the next 250 years of the future, tasks waiting the nation in its unfolding. But the point to close with is that self-rule, the principle of self-rule, the vindication of the principle of self-rule was at the heart of it all. This was to be a republican form of government. It was to be a republic, and it was to be a republic in which the principle that men, generically speaking, men and women, rule themselves, and that not by kings, not by monarchs, but they rule themselves. And this is the founding principle of the country that would come to be. Thank you.